Hey guys, back from a little vacation in Maryland, hence the sunburn. Probably better than having a pale complexion, is kind of that's my usual kind of inclination. Yeah, I don't really deal with the sun. It's either like an overexposure where I'm in there too long and I don't put enough sunscreen on, or it's just like no sun or not a tan at all. So, but basically, I'm going to attempt to talk about Ottessa Moshfegh's, I think. Ottessa Moshfegh, I think. It's not as hard as it looks, I think. Um, Her novel Eileen, which probably isn't, is probably, it came out 2015, still pretty kind of modern, not too long ago, at least in my sense of time. But yeah, it's an interesting, I don't think it's as well known as like her other book, more notable, Rest in My Year of Rest and Relaxation, or my was it my time of rest and my I think it was my years of rest and relaxation. But this is the only one that I've read so far of Mossfegg's, but I intend to obviously slowly read the rest as I do with Octavia Butler and Zadie Smith eventually. I'm only 100 pages into White Teeth, and I really, really like it so far, so I'm definitely going to have to obviously, take my time with it, but at the same time, kind of, you know. But anyway, so Eileen is the titular character of she narrates her life in hindsight in a kind of very wistful yet confident tone, um, from first person narrative, obviously, and about her village, almost an idyllic yet mundane kind of dry town of she only calls Xville in Massachusetts. So up in the New England coast, so everything. I get the sense that when I was in Massachusetts for work a few years back, right when COVID was breaking out, I remember how kind of how like peaceful yet there was like I'm not sure, like a kind of quiet, like everything was almost too nice. And I guess that's kind of, but there's, she was right. Like her, she says that there's a great amount of poets that come from that. Obviously, famously, um, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and I think Edgar Allan Poe came from like New England towns, and yeah, it was pretty interesting. Like Salem, seeing that, and but anyway, so she's living in this town, and she feels like, excuse the cat. Technically not interrupting, but yeah. She's probably got like tons of ticks on her. Anyway, so yeah, losing my train of thought here. Um, she lives in this small town, and it's basically with her alcoholic father, who also suffers from like severe kind of paranoia, and she's like he is a and again, like it's kind of all the characters in this are kind of referred to like her father, or her mother, or her sister, aside from maybe her sister. Basically, Joni, her sister. But yeah, she doesn't like refer to her father by name. So, um, anyway, but yeah, so he is a used to be a police officer, but he was kind of not quite disgraced, but kind of more or less indistinguished and like very feeble and like kind of with a temper, and he has a kind of but she actually, in a weird way, Eileen claims that she likes it better when he's actually kind of drunk a little bit, because it numbs him, and he's actually not as eagle-eyed and seeing like her faults and all that. So like constantly, but when he's constantly, he's like comparing her to Joni, and like she's like the better sibling, and she's like a lot better. She's a lot more like filled out. I guess, does not to sound creepy, but she's like Eileen is 24 at this time in 1964. So yeah, she's like feels like to be a very late bloomer, and she's like thin and wiry, and very like withdrawn, and driven to like books and like escaping into literature. Although interestingly enough, she says that she doesn't nowadays, or at least like from her point of view of later on, 50 years in the future, that she doesn't like find novels to be a good form, because it like kind of you're creating a world that's like not, it's fictional. But so she works at a this correctional facility for underage boys who are thrown into that on account of their different crimes and stuff. And it's you get kind of a 60s kind of traditionalist kind of up from the bootstraps, kind of speak softly and carry a big stick kind of mindset of how to deal with like deviant young boys, and and these all they're kids under the age of 18, so it's like all like some of them. And later on we learn that there's a young boy named Lee Polk, and he is basically put in a specific part in the solitary confinement called the cave, and he's it's very shy, and basically doesn't seem like he seems like way too nice and genuine, like a good kid. I think he's, what is he? I think he's 14, and like and he has to spend the rest of his life because he's accused of killing his father. But then what happens is, like, as time goes on, Eileen and Rebecca's basically the first friend that she has. Rebecca is like very gorgeous and like effortlessly confident, and is like spinning image of like what Eileen wishes she was, in a sense. And I'm not sure how much this is going into just like kind of psychology, or with like the symbolic kind of the individuation process. I'm not sure like how much of this is supposed to be. I do know that Ottessa Moshfegh said that she wanted to make something a little bit more mainstream, not to put words in her mouth, but I think she wanted to make something more accessible. So this is written in such a way that's like it's still nostalgic, and it's still well written, but it's also the storyline and the characters are simple and without being truncated, but they're simple and enough that it's accessible to a wider audience and appeals to that demographic without necessarily selling out, being kind of a sellout on making truncated kind of like cartoonish characters, like like the villain kind of aspect to the father is like more or less just like a symptom of his paranoia. He has his clear mental disorder. Like, he sees her father basically is constantly thinks he's being surveyed by these other people, like particularly, like, even at some points he says he sees like ghosts, literally. And he's like, sometimes it's like young kids that he thinks he sees, and other times, so like he's accused of like throwing beer bottles and stuff at them. And yeah, but he's always kind of like dismissed, and like people, and basically has to it's a tacit agreement where Eileen has to like look after her father and take take the kind of the onus of taking responsibility for all his ills that he's doing, and constantly having to deal with. And there's a big whole aspect of her feeling like the shame and the feeling guilt too, but like most of all just feeling like like, why am I looking after him? Like, he doesn't care like whatsoever about me. He doesn't care about like, obviously I'm like the lesser out of the two kids. Like, I am not the favorite, and he's shown partiality, like, and even though he's drunk, it's a very complicated kind of relationship that she has. Like, feels, if anything, just more guilty, or not guilty, but she feels more pity for him. Like, she loves and stays there out of pity. Like, she sees him almost like as a helpless child in many respects. And in some respects he is like a helpless child, and can't fend for himself. And like, every time he has to go out, and he has a gun, and then she has to like take over his gun for him. And that actually, Chekhov's gun, classic fashion, kind of plays a part later on in the novel, with spoilers, that her and her new friend Rebecca, she's this very effortlessly confident, outgoing, and just they go to a different to a bar and a local space where they can and like she's able to speak up for Rebecca without being patronizing, and it's like a perfect kind of friendship that they have. She's able to flatter her and say like, hey, like, I actually wish I wasn't, I built like I was, and wish I was like, sometimes I was thin and petite like you have a delicate frame. And she's able to kind of see that, but it's all kind of, there's a thing where she's like, a repeating motif here is the death mask that Eileen keeps saying, like, I try to keep my cards close, I try to wear a death mask, and, and this is especially obvious when she tries to, when she's, like, fantasizing about Randy. The Randy is a prison guard who's very attractive as well, and he's, there's a bit of a love triangle dynamic going on here between Randy, Rebecca, and Eileen that is kind of makes her, she's like, she sees with Randy, like, even though maybe he's not, like, particularly smart, or not particularly, but he is obviously, like, there's a kind of an Adonis kind of, like a masculine, but kind of boyish at the same time aspect of him. Like, he's muscly, and like, and has a solid frame, and basically she, like, like, fantasizes about him as a kind of means, as like, but is always too shy to approach and, like, talk to him unless it's, like, kind of absolutely necessary. And even then, she's nervous about, like, what he might think of her, and, like, like, she's probably, like, she's, like, says something like, he would rather be with somebody like Rebecca, and that's kind of what does happen, hence the love triangle, where she's, like, very jealous, even though she, like, loves, and it's that confusing kind of thing that, young people have, as, I think regardless of gender. Like, I think it's, like, this idea of, like, you have conflicting kind of feelings for, like, your best friend, yet your best friend is also kind of, like, is taking away, like, your kind of, the one love, romantic kind of love that you have. And yeah, so, but then, so this is the sticky part, where with Lee Polk, and he is, like, kept in the solitary confinement, and Rebecca basically invites her, Eileen, over to her house, and then she finds that it's, like, a lot more kind of, like, moribund and bellicose, with, like, it's like everything's kind of in upheaval, and, like, it's a great big mess, and she's, like, surprised, like, oh, this, I didn't expect, Rebecca, I thought she was, like, so high class, and that she would, like, she'd have a baby grand sitting out there, like, but no, she's, she's got, like, she's, at least apparently, she's in this little kind of den, and is, like, talks, and, like, eventually, after some time, she finally admits, like, okay, this isn't my house, this is actually Mrs. Polk's house, and that she has her tied down in the basement, and this is where it gets kind of more suspenseful. And the fact, and now all of a sudden, with Eileen and within the mix, and she's, like, carrying her father's gun, they both go down there to kind of, like, use some kind of deal. So it's, like, basically, they're trying to eke out of Mrs. Polk, like, what happened, because with Lee has basically been accused of, has been in his file, in the case file, which they both read in, like, actual physical file, and they basically, the case file says that he was raped by Mr. Polk, and that Mr. Polk was an abusive, like, awful, inhuman father that just, like, treated Lee Polk like, like a, basically, like, worse than a dog, actually. And, they basically sexually, like, raped him, and they basically, repeatedly did that, and then Mrs. Polk kind of saw it, just, kind of saw it happen. But obviously, Lee Polk gets killed by, Lee Polk kills his own father. Obviously, there's an Oedipus kind of thing going on here that I think she actually mentions, like, kind of just, like, yeah, I know this is sounding very, like, Oedipus. It's, like, like, I think there's, like, a kind of self-awareness of that aspect of the storyline. And, yeah, basically with, Eileen and Rebecca try to tease out of her without being too forceful, and eventually she accidentally, because, like, of how, just because of the stench of the place, she ends up, like, literally, she can't keep the mask on that she was wearing to, conceal her identity, and Mrs. Polk finds out, like, I recognize you, you're from the correctional facility, and then, yeah, there's, like, because there's a big thing, kind of a big hustle when Mrs. Polk came to visit her son, Lee, and the fact of how, that he was in tears afterwards, like, finally showing, like, like, the true kind of emotion of, like, what she, like, there's indicating that clearly there was something going on beneath the surface that wasn't, so, picturesque. But yeah, then what happens is, like, there's a flub, or a kind of a error in something awful happens, where, I think Rebecca accidentally shoots in like basically like takes, is like accidentally pulls the trigger on the gun, and the gun goes off, and then the bullet ricochets and almost, or like it grazes Mrs. Polk's just by a bit, just enough. But she's like, fearing what might happen. It's like, oh well, if we let her alive, and like she's gonna go out back in the community and basically tell everybody and their mother about like what happened here, and then we have to get out of here. So there's a big kind of compulsion and temptation to like want to just leave this, their little town, and just like get out of there in a way that she was actually thinking. And she was like, yes, I know this sounds awful, but Eileen says to her, in the narrative that informs us that, basically she was thinking about leaving it, the crime scene, to her father, and that her father would wake up and see this kind of, Mrs. Polk, dead, and that he would feel bad, because then finally his kind of antics would come back to bite him, and that he would basically, at best, just be kind of, because people, all his police friends think highly of him, that they would probably rehabilitate, and kind of, his punishment will be light, and he would probably have to, like, spend the rest of the last portion of his life kind of just making up for his wrongs. And that was a tempting thing, but she basically doesn't do that. But Rebecca basically cowers out a little bit, and then she goes on and promises that she's going to meet Eileen after there, but because they carry Mrs. Polk to their car, and that they're going to go out to New York, and they're going to start again. But Rebecca basically flakes out majorly on that, and then she's like she hasn't talked to her since because of that, but she still kind of holds her highly in her heart, obviously, but she's moved on, and it's like kind of, it's like kind of something that can't be repaired. And so they basically, Mrs. Polk, I guess they just leave her back in Exville, and Eileen goes to New York City by herself, and then there's like a new air of confidence to her, and she's like a lot more composed, and has like many loves and relationships. And she says that like one of her best relationships were when somebody, when one of his husbands, like basically fed her nothing but steak, and that she gained 10 pounds, and that she felt like that was the happiest she felt. But and she's like looks back eventually, in her, I'm assuming in her 70s, looks back in hindsight at her life in Expo. And that is Eileen by Ottessa Moshfegh. I definitely recommend it. It's a good memoir kind of story going on. It's a little bit, some parts I felt were a little bit dry, like they could have used, because I think there's a little bit, characters were, I think people kind of criticized Moshfegh for focusing a little bit too much on the negative aspects of her character, like of her, on just things that she did, or just certain aspects of Eileen's like torment, and like her, and like the way she was brought up, and like like. But I think when it comes down to it, I think even though it's like almost anti-romantic, it also does have it's somewhat of a happy ending. So I mean, I guess for what it's worth, I still recommend it. Just kind of make up, I guess everybody will have a different reaction to it. And that's all I have for today. Thank you.